Hello, and thank you for being here with me tonight. Before we begin, let the lingering sounds of the long day slowly fade into the distance, allowing the room to grow quieter, softer, more serene, and as everything around you begins to slow. Tonight, we will journey together to a city set high upon the rooftop of Africa, where the morning mist once drifted silently along the mountainsides, where the hills looked down into the valleys as though guarding an ancient secret, and where a capital blossomed like a new flower in the midst of Ethiopia's history. That city is Addis Ababa. But tonight, we will not hurry to see it merely as a name upon a map, or as a modern capital of broad avenues and brightly lit buildings. We will move more slowly than that. We will begin in the land at the foot of Entoto, when the wind was still cold across the Highlands, when the roads were little more than dusty, half-vanished trails, when hot springs slipped quietly through the earth, as though this place had long been destined to become a center of power, of memory, and of immense historical change. Then, little by little, in the quiet darkness of tonight, that city will begin to emerge, from a royal encampment to the heart of an empire, from a place still very young to a city that would pass through war, occupation, rebirth, revolution, and dreams greater than itself. And as we move through each of those layers of time, perhaps you will begin to feel that Addis Ababa was never merely a capital. It is also the story of how a city is born, how it grows, how it endures, and how it continues to breathe through so many ages. And if, before closing your eyes, you are still awake here with me, try leaving a small greeting in the comments and let me know where you are listening from tonight. Tonight, before Addis Ababa appears with the broad avenues, the rooftops, the government buildings, and the diplomatic halls we know today, I want to invite you to travel far back, to return to a time when that place was not yet a city, not yet a capital, not even a name widely known across the world. Imagine that you are standing upon a vast highland, where the air is thin and cool, where the wind slips across rocky slopes carrying the scent of dry grass, where the sky seems just a little closer than it does above the lowlands below. There, if the night is clear enough, you might almost feel that you could reach out and touch the stars. And beneath that sky lies the land that would one day become the heart of modern Ethiopia. Addis Ababa today rests on a well-watered plateau, surrounded by hills and mountains, near the geographical center of the country. But in this first chapter, the most memorable thing is not yet the location of a capital, but the feeling of a highland world. There are places in the world that make human beings stop because of their fertility. There are places that hold people in place with rivers, with harbors, with the open sea. But here, before anything else, there is elevation, there is air, there is the view. From the high slopes of Entoto, one can look down upon wide stretching land, valleys opening into the distance, roads like thin threads laid across the brown of the earth and the quiet green of the grass. It is that height that gives this place the feeling of being both close to the sky and far from the world. Stand there a little longer on Entoto in your imagination. Do not hurry to search for the city. The city is not here yet, at least not in the form we are about to know in the chapters ahead. there are no avenues yet. There is no fixed center of power, as there will later be. There are no long lines of vehicles, no constant hum of a great urban center. But that does not mean this place is some nameless emptiness. These mountainsides had been seen long before the capital was born. These paths had been walked. These water sources had been known. These patches of land had been rested upon, remembered, and called by name in the lives of the people who lived around this highland. Before there was an imperial capital, this was already a land with its own rhythm, its own breath, its own ancient silence. If you listen more carefully in tonight's story, you may hear the sounds of that land before you hear the sounds of great history. Not the cries of soldiers or the rituals of a palace, but the wind passing through grass, the sound of footsteps on hard ground, the movement of livestock in the distance, the quiet emergence of warm water from the earth below in the lower ground at the foot of the plateau. It is often such small things that come before everything else. History often prefers to speak of rulers, of battles, of treaties, of turning points. But if you look slowly enough, you will see that every city is first and foremost a place where human beings can live, can endure, and can return. The future Addis Ababa, too, would begin from something just that simple. Entoto is the name to remember tonight, because before Addis Ababa, this highland stood at the threshold of a future capital. Later, encyclopedists and historians would call Entoto the direct precursor of Addis Ababa. It lies upon a striking plateau, high enough to be cold, open enough to see far, and isolated enough to carry the feeling of a place that could shelter power. Just imagine a morning on Entoto, while the mist has not yet fully lifted, and you will understand why such a place would appeal to any royal court seeking a foothold in the vast lands of Ethiopia. Up there, the world seems clearer. What lies far away becomes easier to see. Movements below the mountain are hard to miss. And perhaps it was precisely from that feeling that Entoto once held such a singular allure. But history rarely stops at beauty seen from afar. A place that can make a powerful impression on the very first morning is not necessarily a place where people want to live for long. Mountains are beautiful in the way mountains are beautiful. Power, if it wishes to remain, needs more than beauty. It needs water, wood, food, roads, warmth, convenience, and the sense that from one season to the next, people can still light fires, build houses, sustain human life, sustain horses, sustain the entire machinery that follows a royal court. And it is at this point that Entoto begins to reveal another side of itself. It is high, but also too cold. It is magnificent, but life there is far from easy. In time, Entoto would come to be regarded as unsuitable for a long-term capital because of its harsh cold and its severe shortage of firewood. These are two truths that sound very simple. Yet it is precisely such seemingly small things that can alter the course of an entire country's history. Just imagine it, an evening on the highland. The wind has turned sharply cold soon after sunset. In the last light of day, the mountain is still beautiful, but that beauty has begun to harden. Darkness comes sooner than the human spirit expects. To stay warm, one needs fire. To have fire, one needs wood. To have wood, one needs forests, or else wood must be brought in from elsewhere. and once the residence of the royal court is no longer just a handful of roofs, but day by day gathers more followers, more soldiers, more attendants, more craftsmen, more priests, more animals, more kitchens, more storehouses, more labor, then that thing which once seemed small suddenly becomes a very real burden. A future capital cannot depend solely on the grandeur of its landscape. It must also overcome the cold of every night and solve the question of every bundle of wood. And so, within the vast, beautiful, and almost austere landscape of Entoto, history begins to reveal a very human paradox. The highest place is not always the most suitable one. The place with the broadest view is not always the place where life can endure best. A land may leave people in awe when they first set foot there, and yet force them to think of somewhere else when night falls. Perhaps this is one of the quietest truths the history of Addis Ababa wishes to tell us. A city is not chosen by the eye alone, but also by the lungs, by the hands, by the chill upon the skin, by the way the fire burns or fails in the hearth, by whether there will be enough wood for tomorrow. And then, as Entoto gradually revealed its limits, the gaze began to lower toward the foot of the plateau, not far down, but only to a gentler, lower place, less harsh than the heights above. Below, there were hot springs. Below, the air was milder. Below, the land opened onto another way of living, less severe, less sharp than the summit of the highland. Later, the very presence of those hot springs beneath the tableland would become one of the direct reasons why the center of power moved downward. But in this chapter, we stand only at the threshold of that change. We have not yet descended fully. We have only begun to feel that the gaze of history has started to tilt from the heights to the lowlands, from grandeur to habitability. Perhaps you will find this beautiful in a very quiet, nighttime way. A future capital does not begin with a grand declaration, but with human beings realizing that they need a little more warmth, a little easier breath, water closer at hand, wood easier to find, ground easier to inhabit. These things sound so ordinary, yet history so often turns because of the most ordinary things of all. Behind each decision of power, there is often a practical problem of daily life. Behind each new capital, there is often a story of climate, terrain, and the endurance of the people who must live there day after day. If you move slowly enough through this land in your imagination, you will see that the Ethiopian highlands are not merely a still backdrop, but a true character in the story. The wind here does not stand still. The cold here is not merely a sensation, but a force. The mountain slopes are not only beautiful, but demanding. The water is not only there to be admired, but to sustain life. And when a city later rises near the geographical center of the country, on a well-watered plateau surrounded by hills and mountains, that geography is not some incidental detail. It is the first part of destiny. Addis Ababa cannot be separated from the ground that nourished it. Before it was a political idea, it was a geographical answer. Tonight, we should also pause for a moment over the feeling of center. Addis Ababa would later matter for many reasons, but one of the deepest lies in the fact that it is near the center of Ethiopia, from a central region. Power can reach outward more easily in all directions, from a central region. Roads also more easily weave themselves together. But in the time before the city appeared, that center was still only an unspoken potential, like a stretch of land waiting for someone to realize that it could become more than a place lying under sun and wind. There are places destined to become points of convergence, but that destiny does not show itself at once. It takes time. It takes an eye that can recognize it. It takes the first footsteps lingering long enough to understand why this place is different. So if tonight you are lying there listening to this story in the soft darkness, try to imagine those days when the land beneath Entoto was not yet a name that carried far. Morning rises slowly over the highlands. A thin mist hangs on the slopes. The stone absorbs the cold of night and then releases it little by little. The paths appear first not because human hands have planned them, but because they have been traveled often enough, seen from above. The land is not divided into blocks like a future city. It simply opens itself, one layer after another, as though patiently waiting for a larger story to come and dwell there. Perhaps that is also what makes the history of Addis Ababa so compelling. Many capitals around the world wear an air of great antiquity, as if they had always been there from time immemorial. Addis Ababa is different in its very origins. It allows us to see clearly the moment before it existed. We can look at that land while it was not yet a city. We can point to the cold, the shortage of wood, the hot springs beneath the highland, and say, it was from these very things that a new capital would be conceived. Few places allow us to feel so distinctly the transition between not yet and about to become. On Entoto, history at that moment was like someone standing at a crossroads without yet taking a step. One foot still remained on the high ground, where the view was long and the cold bit sharply. The other had begun to lean toward the lower land, where warm vapor rose from the earth. Everything was still quiet. There was no new name yet, no declaration, no announcement that a capital would rise from this place. And yet, in that quiet, you can almost feel the future shifting, not loudly, not suddenly, only a very slight tilt of human desire toward the place easier to live in, easier to light a fire in, easier to remain in. Perhaps that is the best way to close this first chapter. Not with a great event, but with a feeling. The feeling that the land beneath Entoto is beginning to be seen with different eyes, that the highland has fulfilled its role. It has given people a vantage point, a place to pause, an experiment in highland power. And then, through its very cold and its silent privations, it opens the way to a new question. If not up here, then where? If a capital cannot breathe easily atop the plateau, where will it descend? If power wishes to become more enduring, warmer, broader, where should it set down its roots? And so, as the night deepens, and as our imagination too begins to move more slowly, you can see the whole scene as a picture both blurred and clear. Above is Entoto, cold, high, windswept, beautiful like a challenge. Below is the gentler land, where hot water quietly rises from beneath the earth. Between them lies the stillness of a decision not yet spoken aloud. And in that stillness, Addis Ababa has not yet begun. But everything necessary for its beginning is already there: the terrain, the climate, the inconvenience, the hope, and the deeply human intuition that another nearby place might become the answer. So, before we move into the next chapter, let us linger a little longer on this slope of Entoto. Let us take one last look down at the land that still does not yet bear the shape of a capital. Let the cold of the highland, the thinness of the air, and the silence of the slopes enter your imagination, because it is here, before there were palaces, before there were broad roads, before the name Addis Ababa was spoken like a promise. That history began with a very quiet lesson. Not every place that stands highest is the place where human beings can remain the longest. And sometimes, for a city to be born, all that is first required is enough wisdom to listen to the earth, the wind, the water, and one's own fire. Tonight, imagine a very quiet dawn on the land beneath Entoto, when thin wisps of vapor still drift silently up from the hot springs, when the grass is still wet with dew and the first light of day has only just begun to touch the wide slopes of earth. There is no noise of a capital city, no crowded avenues, only the clear, cool air of the Ethiopian highlands, the narrow paths still marked by the footprints of people and animals, and open stretches of land that seem as though they are still waiting for something to begin in that place, amid a stillness almost untouched. No one could yet clearly see the shape of a future city, and yet it is precisely from that silence that a great decision is about to be made. A new place to live will be chosen. The first rooftops will be raised. A center of power will begin to take a root in the ground. And then, from the midst of that vast highland, a name both gentle and enduring will be spoken aloud. As though history did not simply wish to build a capital, but also to let a new flower bloom between the mountain winds and the sky of Africa. Addis Ababa today lies upon a well-watered plateau, surrounded by hills and mountains, near the geographical center of the country. But in this first chapter, the most memorable thing is not yet the location of a capital, but the feeling of a highland land. There are places in the world that make people stop because of their fertility. There are places that hold people with a river, with a harbor, with the open sea. But here, before anything else, there is elevation, there is air, there is the view. From the high slopes of Entoto, one can look down upon wide-stretching lands, valleys opening into the distance, and roads like fine threads laid across the brown of the earth and the quiet green of the grasses. It is that height that gives this place the feeling of being both close to the sky and far from the world. Stand still a little longer on Entoto in your imagination. Do not hurry to search for the city. The city is not here yet, at least not in the form we are about to know in the chapters ahead. There are no avenues yet, no fixed center of power, such as would come later, no lines of vehicles, no constant hum of a great urban world. But that does not mean this place is some nameless emptiness. These mountainsides had been seen long before the capital was born. These paths had been walked. These water sources had been known. These patches of land had been rested upon, remembered, and called by name in the lives of the people who lived around this highland. before there was an imperial capital. This place was already a land with its own rhythm, its own breath, its own ancient silence. If you listen more carefully in tonight's story, you may hear the sounds of that land before you hear the sounds of great history. Not the cries of soldiers or the rituals within a palace, but the wind moving through the grass, the sound of footsteps on hard ground, the movement of livestock in the distance, the quiet rising of warm water from beneath the earth in the lower land at the foot of the plateau. It is often such small things that are there before everything else. History likes to speak of rulers, of battles, of treaties, of great turning points. But if you look slowly enough, you will see that every city is first and foremost a place where human beings can live, endure, and return. The Addis Ababa of the future, too, would begin from something that simple. Entoto is the name to remember tonight, because before Addis Ababa, this very highland stood at the threshold of a future capital. Later, encyclopedists and historians would call Entoto the direct precursor of Addis Ababa. It lies upon a striking plateau, high enough to be cold, open enough to see far, and secluded enough to carry the feeling of a place that could shelter power. Just imagine a morning on Entoto, while the mist has not yet fully lifted, and you will understand why such a place would appeal to any royal court seeking a foothold in the vast lands of Ethiopia. Up there, the world seems clearer. What lies far away becomes easier to see. Movements beneath the mountain are difficult to miss. And perhaps it was precisely from that feeling that Entoto once held such a singular allure. But history rarely stops at beauty seen from afar. A place that can make a powerful impression on the very first morning is not necessarily a place where people would wish to live for long. Mountains are beautiful in the way mountains are beautiful. Power, if it wishes to remain, needs more than beauty. It needs water, wood, food, roads, warmth, convenience, and the feeling that from one season to the next, people can still light fires, build houses, sustain human life, sustain horses, sustain the entire machinery that follows a royal court. And it is at this point that Entoto begins to reveal another side of itself. It is high, but also too cold. It is magnificent, yet life upon it is far from easy. Later, Entoto would be considered unsuitable as a long-term capital because of its severe cold and the serious shortage of firewood. These are two truths that sound very simple. Yet it is precisely such seemingly small things that can alter the course of an entire country's history. Just imagine it, an evening on the highland. The wind has turned sharply cold very soon after sunset. In the last light of day, the mountain is still beautiful, but that beauty has begun to harden. Darkness comes sooner than the human spirit expects. To stay warm, there must be fire. To have fire, there must be wood. To have wood, there must be forest, or else it must be brought in from elsewhere. And once the residence of the royal court is no longer just a handful of roofs, but gathers more followers day by day, more soldiers, attendants, craftsmen, priests, animals, kitchens, storehouses, and labor, then that thing which once seemed small suddenly becomes a very real burden. A future capital cannot rely solely upon the grandeur of its landscape. It must also defeat the cold of every night and solve the problem of every bundle of wood. And so, within the vast, beautiful, almost austere landscape of Entoto, history begins to reveal a deeply human paradox. The highest place is not always the most suitable one. The place with the longest view is not always the place where life can endure best. A stretch of land may leave people in awe the first time they set foot there, and yet force them to think of somewhere else whenever night falls. Perhaps this is one of the quietest truths that the history of Addis Ababa wishes to tell us. A city is not chosen by the eye alone, but also by the lungs, by the hands, by the chill upon the skin, by the way the fire burns or dies in the hearth, by whether there will be enough wood for tomorrow. And then, as Entoto gradually revealed its limits, the gaze began to lower beneath the plateau, not far down, but only to a gentler, lower place, less harsh than the heights above. Down there were hot springs. Down there the air was milder. Down there the land opened itself to another way of living, less severe, less sharp than the summit of the highland. Later, the very presence of those hot springs below the tableland would become one of the direct reasons why the center of power moved downward. But in this chapter, we are only standing at the threshold of that change. We have not yet gone all the way down. We can only just feel that the gaze of history has begun to tilt from high ground to low, from grandeur toward habitability. Perhaps you will find this beautiful in a very quiet, nighttime way. A future capital does not begin with some grand declaration, but with human beings realizing that they need a little more warmth, a little easier breath, water closer at hand, wood easier to find, ground easier to inhabit. These things sound so ordinary, and yet history so often turns because of the most ordinary things of all. Behind each decision of power, there is often a practical question of daily life. Behind each new capital, there is often a story of climate, terrain, and the endurance of the people who must live there every day. If you move slowly enough through this land in your imagination, you will see that the Ethiopian highlands are not merely a still backdrop, but a true character in the story. The wind here does not stand still. The cold here is not merely a sensation, but a force. The mountain slopes are not only beautiful, but demanding. The water is not only there to be admired, but to sustain life. And when a city later rises near the geographical center of the country, upon a well-watered plateau surrounded by hills and mountains, that geography is not some incidental detail. It is the first part of destiny. Addis Ababa cannot be separated from the ground that nourished it. Before it was a political idea, it was a geographical answer. Tonight, we should also pause for a moment over the feeling of center. Addis Ababa would later matter for many reasons, but one of the deepest lies in the fact that it is near the center of Ethiopia, from a central region. Power can reach outward more easily in all directions. From a central region, roads can also weave together more easily. But in the time before the city appeared, that center was still only an unspoken potential, like a stretch of land waiting for someone to realize that it could become more than a place lying beneath the sun and wind. There are places destined to become points of convergence, but that destiny does not show itself at once. It takes time. It takes an eye that can recognize it. It takes the first footsteps lingering long enough to understand why this place is different. So, if tonight you are lying there listening to this story in the soft darkness, Try to imagine those days when the land beneath Entoto was not yet a name that carried far. Morning rises slowly over the highlands. A thin mist hangs on the slopes. Stone absorbs the cold of night and then releases it little by little. The paths appear first not because human hands have planned them, but because they have been traveled often enough, seen from above. The land is not divided into blocks like some future city. It simply opens itself, one layer after another, as though patiently waiting for a larger story to come and dwell there. Perhaps that too is what makes the history of Addis Ababa so compelling. Many capitals around the world wear an air of great antiquity, as though they had always been there from time immemorial. Addis Ababa is different in its very origins. It allows us to see clearly the moment before it existed. We can look upon that land while it was not yet a city. We can point to the cold, the shortage of wood, the hot springs beneath the highland, and say, it was from these very things that a new capital would be conceived. Few places allow us to feel so distinctly the transition between not yet and about to become on Entoto. History at that moment was like someone standing at a crossroads without yet taking a step. One foot still remained on the high ground, where the view was long and the cold cut sharply. The other had begun to lean toward the lower land, where warm vapor rose from the earth. Everything was still quiet. There was no new name yet, no declaration, no announcement that a capital would rise from this place. And yet, in that quiet, you can almost feel the future shifting, not loudly, not suddenly, only a very slight leaning of human desire toward the place easier to live in, easier to light a fire in, easier to remain in. Perhaps that is the best way to close this first chapter, not with a great event, but with a feeling, the feeling that the land beneath Entoto is beginning to be seen with different eyes, that the highland has fulfilled its role. It has given people a vantage point, a place to pause, an experiment in power upon the heights. And then, through its very cold and its silent privations, it opens the way to a new question. If not up here, then where? If a capital cannot breathe easily atop the plateau, where will it descend? If power wishes to become more enduring, warmer, broader, where should it set down its roots? And so, as the night deepens, and as our imagination too begins to move more slowly, you can see the whole scene like a picture, both blurred and clear. Above is Entoto, cold, high, windswept, beautiful like a challenge. Below is the gentler land, where hot water quietly rises from beneath the earth. Between them lies the stillness of a decision not yet spoken aloud, and in that stillness, Addis Ababa has not yet begun. But everything necessary for its beginning is already there: the terrain, the climate, the inconvenience, the hope, and the deeply human intuition that another nearby place might become the answer. Imagine Addis Ababa on such a day. The air over the highlands is still cool and clear. Morning cooking smoke still drifts low above the newly built roofs. The dirt roads around the royal residence still carry the look of a young city, not yet fully formed. not yet shaped into the image of an ancient capital. But beneath that quiet surface is another feeling, a feeling of waiting, as though this whole land were leaning in, listening to movements far beyond its sight. In the north, history is drawing near in the sound of marching armies, in promises and betrayals, in the ambition of a European empire, and in the resolve of a king who has no intention of allowing Ethiopia to be called by another's name. Here, Addis Ababa is no longer merely a newly born city. It begins to carry the weight of an imperial center, not only because Menelik II had raised it up as his place of residence, but because from here, his decisions would gradually begin to shape a modern Ethiopia. Menelik, born Sala Mariam, had been the king of Shewa before proclaiming himself Emperor of Ethiopia on March 25, 1889. That same year, he signed the Treaty of Wichale with Italy, an agreement that would later become the seed of a major conflict. The Italian version of Article 17 implied that Ethiopia would have to conduct its foreign affairs through Italy, as though accepting the status of a protectorate, while the Amharic version carried no such binding meaning. Menelik ultimately rejected that interpretation, and from that fracture, the road to Adwa began to open. But before Adwa became a name that would shake history, Addis Ababa first had to learn how to become the capital of a ruler who did not merely wish to hold on to a throne, but to gather the scattered pieces of a vast land beneath a single center. Menelik was not a man who sat still in his palace waiting for fate to arrive. He was a man of movement, of consolidation, of expansion, of negotiation, of weapons, of campaigns, and of deeply calculated judgment. He used the strength of Shewa, together with the resources and modern arms he had acquired, to secure his position after the death of Emperor Johannes IV in 1889, and as Menelik settled firmly upon the throne. Addis Ababa began to change with him, from the new residence of the royal household. It gradually became the place from which power flowed outward, and the place to which power returned. Try to imagine the city at that time. It had none of the monumental presence of an old capital, none of the centuries hardened into stone, into ritual, into familiar order. Menelik's Addis Ababa was still young, still rough-edged, still carrying something of the feel of an encampment growing too quickly. But that was precisely what gave it life. For this was not a capital inherited from some distant past. This was the place where an empire was remaking itself. Around the center of power were soldiers, nobles, horsekeepers, storehouse guards, blacksmiths, carpenters, priests, messengers, food sellers, and those still waiting for opportunity. All of those faces, though seldom named in the chronicles, were the true flesh and blood of Imperial Addis Ababa. By day, the city must have been full of more hurried movement than we might imagine. Meetings in the courtyards of the palace, groups of people coming and going, conversations about borders, loyalty, weapons, harvests, and stores of grain. Menelik understood very clearly something that every ruler in a time of upheaval must understand. Power does not lie only in a crown or in declarations. It lies in the ability to make distant lands turn their gaze toward one center. And Addis Ababa, in this period, was that center each day. Its role deepened. It was no longer merely the new flower blooming on land, easier to live on than Entoto. It was beginning to become the more forcefully beating heart of an Ethiopia still gathering the shape of itself. But history gave Menelik no peace in which to build, only in silence. The Treaty of Wichale, signed on May 2nd, 1889, carried within it a dangerous ambiguity. When Italy used the Italian version of Article 17 to declare Ethiopia an Italian protectorate, Menelik first tried to resolve the matter through diplomacy. Then, between 1891 and 1893, he both protested and prepared, sending expeditions southward and eastward to collect gold, ivory, coffee, and other resources in exchange for modern weapons and ammunition. In September 1893, he formally repudiated the treaty in full. Once confrontation became difficult to avoid, this was no longer a matter of disputed wording. It was a question of who had the right to name Ethiopia, and whether Addis Ababa would be the capital of an independent empire or a center overshadowed by colonial rule. From this point on, the story of Addis Ababa began to take on the heartbeat of war. Even though the battlefield did not lie within the city itself, perhaps that is one of the strangest things about capitals. Often, the guns fire far away, yet the city is the first place to feel the pressure. Addis Ababa must have lived through days like that, days when news from the north was not merely news, but the breath of every household that had sent someone to war. Days when the stables were restless, the grain stores uneasy, the courtyards unsettled. Days when a young city understood that its fate was being decided beyond the reach of its eyes. And yet, the consequences would return here, pressing themselves into every stone, every road, every sleep of those who remained behind. Menelik did not enter into the confrontation with Italy in the posture of an uncertain king. He prepared with great care. Britannica records that after 2 years of favorable harvests had filled Ethiopia's granaries, he marched into Tigray in December 1895. The Italians believed that a relatively small force would be enough to control Ethiopia. But on March 1st, 1896, at Adwa, that calculation shattered. Under the command of Menelik II, a large and well-armed Ethiopian force crushed the Italian assault led by General Oreste Baratieri. That battle not only halted Italy's imperial ambitions in Ethiopia, but Britannica emphasizes that it was the first crushing defeat of a European power at the hands of African forces during the colonial period. Pause there for a long moment, because Adwa was not merely a military victory. It was a sound that echoed very far, farther than Ethiopia's mountain ranges, farther than the roads along which the news of victory had to travel back to Addis Ababa. One can imagine the day that news reached the capital. First, a very human disbelief. Then whispers spreading quickly. Then faces lingering on one another a little longer, as though not yet daring to believe. And finally, a feeling rising up that must have been difficult to describe in full. Ethiopia had stood firm. A European empire had been driven back, and Addis Ababa, that very young city, suddenly took on a new meaning. It was no longer merely the residence of an emperor. It became the place to which that victory belonged, the place where sovereignty itself came home to dwell. From that moment on, Addis Ababa changed. Even if its outward form did not alter much in a single day, some cities grow through brick and stone. Some grow through the movement of people and goods. And there are cities that grow because after a certain event, the world begins to look at them differently. Addis Ababa was such a city. After Adwa, it bore the weight of a symbol. Here was the center of a court that had not submitted. Here was the capital of a ruler who had refused to let his country's fate be rewritten through the distorted text of someone else. Here was the place from which a single no had been spoken, and then defended through armies, provisions, organization, and will. On October 26, 1896, the Treaty of Addis Ababa was signed, formally ending the conflict with Italy that had arisen from the Treaty of Huichale. This agreement annulled the earlier treaty and forced Italy to recognize Ethiopia's full independence. The fact that the peace treaty itself bore the name Addis Ababa says a great deal about the city's new standing. A name once given with the meaning of new flower was now tied to the affirmation of an African nation's sovereignty against European colonial ambition. That was a turning point that not many capitals on the continent could claim at the end of the 19th century. But what makes this chapter 3 truly memorable is not only the victory at Adwa, but the way that victory changed the very nature of Addis Ababa. The city had been born from the need for a livable place, then grown like a camp of power, and now it moved into another layer of meaning. It became an imperial capital in the fullest sense. Menelik was no longer merely the founder of a new center in the Shawan Highlands. He became the emperor who proved, both to his own country and to the world, that this center was not some temporary foothold, but a place from which a state could speak in its own voice. After 1896, Menelik continued to expand the Solomonic state into regions that had never before been under its rule. And the period from 1896 to 1906 is often seen as the time when Ethiopia expanded to nearly its present scale. Addis Ababa, therefore, did not merely witness the victory, it absorbed the consequences of that victory into its very core. Try to imagine an afternoon in Addis Ababa after Adwa. The sun sinks slowly over the highlands. Golden light settles across rooftops that are not yet too densely spread. In the great courtyards of the nobility, in the quarters of the soldiers, in the open spaces where traders pause, there must have been a feeling very different from before. Not that everyone suddenly became wealthy or carefree. Life was still life. People still had to cook, tend livestock, guard storehouses, carry water, repair houses, wait for rain, and worry over the harvest. But one thing had changed. It was the confidence of a capital that knew it stood at the true center of the nation's fate. That feeling could not be seen, yet it was real. It entered the way people walked, the way they spoke of the court, the way they looked toward the palace and knew that it was not merely ruling, but had just preserved the right of an entire land to decide for itself. Even so, Menelik and his Addis Ababa are not entirely gentle images if we look closely. Behind the strength of the empire was an entire machinery of territorial expansion, resource extraction, enforced loyalties, and the use of force to gather many different lands into one state. It was not a soft process, and precisely because of that, Imperial Addis Ababa carried both radiance and weight. It was the place where power was felt very clearly, the place where decisions concerning faraway frontiers were formed, the place where people began to understand that this city would not live a small life. It would continue to grow, continue to draw toward itself roads, resources, ambitions, and dreams of a stronger Ethiopia. Perhaps that is what bound Menelik II and Addis Ababa so deeply together. On one side stood a man with the will to unify, with political shrewdness, with a determination not to bow before the ambition of protectorate rule. On the other stood a city still very young, yet flexible enough to become the shape of a new power. Menelik needed Addis Ababa as a place in which to set the heart of his empire, and Addis Ababa needed Menelik in order to grow from a new flower into a capital with true historical weight. In the final years of the 19th century, those two destinies lifted one another upward. Perhaps one of the strangest moments in the life of a city is when it first begins to hear the sound of a new age. Imagine Addis Ababa in the early years of the 20th century. The mornings on the Highlands are still as cool as ever. The wind still passes over the open ground and the hillsides around the city. The palace remains the center of power. The dirt roads are still dusty. Hearth fires still burn in the courtyards of homes. But somewhere, far beyond the rhythm of life people have long been used to, something is approaching, the trembling sound of iron, of wheels, of rails, of telegraph wires, of messages traveling faster than horses, of goods moving farther than caravans, of a world that no longer waits for human beings to cross each mile of land at a slow pace. Addis Ababa, after the victory at Adwa and after the first years of consolidating imperial authority under Menelik II, now had to face a different question: how to become not only a symbol of sovereignty, but a capital capable of functioning in the modern age. And it is here that the rhythm of the city begins to change. Menelik II established ministries, initiated modern education, built telephone and telegraph systems, and pushed forward the railway from Djibouti to Addis Ababa, beginning to draw this new capital out of the enclosed rhythm of the Highlands and connect it to the outside world. What makes this period so compelling is that Addis Ababa did not modernize in one sudden leap, but through many overlapping layers of change. After 1896, when Ethiopia had expanded to nearly its present size, revenue from the outer regions was brought back to modernize the new capital, to open schools and hospitals, and to build networks of communication. That meant Addis Ababa was no longer only the place where great decisions were proclaimed. It was beginning to become the place where those decisions were turned into institutions, into structures, into invisible threads linking the center to the rest of the country. If before, the city had carried the shape of a royal encampment growing larger, now it was slowly learning how to live like a system. People were no longer merely building houses and gathering around the palace. They were beginning to think in terms of administration, connection, communication, healing, teaching, taxation, and the regulation of the flow of wealth between center and periphery. Addis Ababa moved slowly, but step by step. It was leaving behind its childhood. Yet perhaps nothing changed the feeling of the city as profoundly as the railway. before the laying of tracks. Ethiopia had lived largely to the rhythm of caravans, to the endurance of men and beasts, along paths where goods had to move slowly from the highlands toward the sea, or from the sea into the interior. A landlocked country like Ethiopia understood that distance all too well. The distance to a port was not merely distance on a map. It was time, labor, cost, and the uncertainty surrounding everything taken out to sell or brought in to use. When Menelik signed a contract with a French company to build the railway between Addis Ababa and Djibouti, it was not merely a transport project, it was an act of reorientation. It opened the possibility for this new capital to turn its gaze toward the Gulf of Aden and the currents of international trade, rather than looking only inward toward its own interior. Britannica emphasizes that this railway encouraged the exploitation of Ethiopia's products by foreign merchants working in cooperation with the ruling elite. In other words, the railway did not merely bring convenience. It pulled Addis Ababa into a far broader network of power and commerce. Pause for a moment over that image. A highland city born from the need to find a place easier to live in than Entoto was now beginning to hear the call of distant ports. From Addis Ababa to Djibouti is a long journey, passing through lands of shifting altitude, changing climate, and different landscapes. But once the tracks were laid down, distance was no longer merely the exhaustion of caravan after caravan. It became an artery. From the sea could come machinery, imported goods, ideas, techniques, paperwork, foreigners, and the many things a modernizing state urgently needed. From the highlands could go coffee, hides, agricultural produce, and the wealth of a country whose commerce was beginning to connect more directly to markets beyond its borders. And when a city is placed at the inland end of such an artery, it cannot help but change. It will think differently, breathe differently, and grow differently. For a time, before the railway reached all the way to Addis Ababa, the new commercial rhythm began to take shape at intermediate points. Dawa, long a caravan center, developed into the principal gateway for the trade of Harar after 1904, when it became the terminus of the railway from the port of Djibouti before the tracks were later extended to Addis Ababa. That detail shows that modernization did not come to Ethiopia like a lightning bolt striking the capital all at once. It moved along transport corridors, through towns, through nodes of exchange, and only then gathered its full weight in Addis Ababa. But precisely for that reason, once the railway finally connected the capital to the route to the sea, its impact was even deeper. Addis Ababa did not merely receive a new means of transportation. It received a new place on the economic map of the entire country. Even so, Addis Ababa's modernization did not lie only on the rails. It also lay in quieter changes, but more enduring ones: telephones, telegraphs, ministries, schools, hospitals. Menelik II understood that if a capital was to function as the heart of a modern state, power could not rest only on the sacred distance surrounding the palace or on the loyalty of the nobility. It needed speed in communication. It needed organization. It needed places to train people to work within a new kind of administrative machinery. It needed medical care for a growing population. It needed a clearer language of administration. And, as Britannica notes, It was during Menelik's later years that such institutions began to be established. Thus, the city changed not only in outward form, but in its inner, invisible rhythm. A true city often does not begin with grand buildings, but with the fact that news travels faster. Papers are processed more steadily, and more people wake each morning to perform the work of a new order. And yet, Addis Ababa remained Addis Ababa of the Highlands, and that meant that even in the process of modernization, the city still had to wrestle with the very real problems of daily life. A growing population meant a greater need for firewood in the cool climate of the mountains. Britannica records that by 1905, large numbers of eucalyptus trees from Australia had been introduced into the city, later spreading widely and forming a leafy cover over Addis Ababa. That detail may sound small from a distance, but in fact, it says a great deal about the nature of modernization here. Addis Ababa did not modernize by neglecting the needs of daily life. It modernized even at the level of the hearth fire, of materials, of a livable landscape. Those trees later became part of the city's appearance, but at first, they were simply a practical answer to the needs of survival in a capital growing too quickly. It is the kind of detail that allows Addis Ababa to retain something deeply human, even as it enters larger economic networks. Perhaps you can feel that changing rhythm most clearly if you imagine an ordinary day in Addis Ababa at the beginning of the 20th century. In the morning, near the center, one would still see soldiers, nobles, attendants, priests, porters, traders. But woven among them were now the figures of a new age: clerks, couriers, messengers, merchants thinking in terms of orders and prices rather than simply journeys and horsepower. The city was no longer merely a place where power was stationed. It was gradually becoming a place where many kinds of movement met. From the periphery, goods came into the center. From the center, orders and demands flowed outward. From the ports, imported goods moved into the interior. From the interior, the country's products found their way into the world. Addis Ababa was no longer only in the middle of Ethiopia in a geographical sense. It was beginning to stand in the middle of exchange. And once that happened, the atmosphere of the city was bound to change. That change also carried a paradox with it. Railways and trade made Addis Ababa richer in rhythm, more dynamic, more full of possibility. But at the same time, they also bound the city more tightly to the unequal relationships of the world at that time. Britannica is very clear that the railway to Djibouti encouraged the exploitation of the country's products by foreign merchants working together with the ruling elite. That means openness did not bring only opportunity. It also brought pressure, competition, and new forms of economic dependence. A capital that turns its face toward the world can never choose to receive only what is favorable. It must also learn how to live with flows of money, with agreements, with foreign interests, and with people who approach it not out of love for the Ethiopian highlands, but because of what can be bought and sold there. Modern Addis Ababa, therefore, was never entirely innocent from the very beginning. It learned how to grow alongside both the opportunities and the cost of connection. By the early years of Haile Selassie, that rhythm of modernization gained yet another layer. Britannica notes that in the period from 1931 to 1934, Haile Selassie promoted projects involving roads, schools, hospitals, communications, administration, and public services. The combined effect of these efforts was to bring Ethiopia into closer contact with the world economy. And by 1932, the taxes levied on more than 25,000 tons of coffee exported each year were flowing into Addis Ababa. That image alone is deeply suggestive, from coffee-growing regions far from the capital. Through an increasingly tight commercial network, tax revenue was flowing here, into the roads, the government offices, the institutions, the expanding needs of a city trying to become a capital in the modern sense. Addis Ababa was no longer merely a place where delegations arrived to pay homage or armies departed for war. It had become the place where budgets converged, where projects rose from the ground, where the future was being written through paperwork, taxation, and transport. And with that, the commercial character of Addis Ababa also became clearer. Britannica describes the city as the point through which most of Ethiopia's import-export activity passes on its way to and from the ports of Djibouti, or Assab, while also serving as the collecting and distribution center for much of the country's domestic trade. Though that description reflects Addis Ababa at a later, more developed stage, it reveals clearly the direction in which the city had already begun to move in this fourth chapter. From an inland center of power, it was becoming the commercial knot of the whole country. A city like that would be entirely different from a capital sustained only by ritual and court ceremony. It needed warehouses, markets, money changers, bookkeepers, speculators, people measuring time not only by religious seasons, but by shipments. And when that happens, the entire feeling of a city changes with it. Its mornings become busier, its afternoons grow heavier with goods. Its nights fill more deeply with calculations for tomorrow. But what I love most about Addis Ababa in this period is that even while it is modernizing, it does not entirely lose the slowness of a highland city. Change comes, but it does not erase the older foundation in a single night beneath the telegraph and the railway. It remains a city where the hearth fire still matters, where the open stretches of land and the hills around it still shape the feeling of life, where royal authority is still deeply present, where daily existence still clings to older habits even as the new slowly slips in. It is that layering that makes Addis Ababa so cinematic in the imagination. You can picture, in the same afternoon, somewhere a porter still walking down a dusty road beneath a heavy load, while elsewhere, a telegraph signal is being sent. And elsewhere again, people are discussing how goods will travel out to sea by rail. The past and the future do not switch shifts neatly. For a while, they live side by side. And it is in that interval that the city has its own soul. And so, as we leave Addis Ababa tonight at the end of this chapter, perhaps the image that should remain is of a city changing the rhythm of its breathing, not so loudly that it loses itself, and yet no longer merely a place enclosed within the Highlands. Somewhere, the railway has drawn a long thread from the capital to the sea. Somewhere, Ethiopia's products have already begun to travel farther. Somewhere, the tax money from coffee has already flowed into new works. Somewhere, messages have begun to move faster than horses, and in the midst of that very motion, Addis Ababa becomes something different, more modern, more connected, richer in opportunity, but also more complex. It remains the new flower of the Ethiopian highlands. Only now, that flower no longer blooms in silence deep within the interior. It has begun to turn toward the world. Imagine Addis Ababa in the first days of May 1936. The light still falls over the highlands as it always has. The mornings are still cool, the slopes around the city still silent, the roads still carrying their familiar coat of dust. But within the city itself, everything has changed. The bad news no longer comes from far away. It has stepped straight into the center. Emperor Haile Selassie has left the country for exile. Italian mechanized columns have entered the capital, and only days later, Benito Mussolini proclaims the Italian Empire in East Africa. Ethiopia is absorbed into Italian East Africa, and Addis Ababa from that point becomes the capital of a new colonial entity that will exist from 1936 to 1941. A city that had once stood as a symbol of African independence is now placed beneath the flag of its conqueror. The deepest pain of an occupation often does not lie in the moment the army enters, but in the days that follow, when life continues and yet no longer belongs to itself. Addis Ababa did not disappear. The city was still there, with its rooftops, its markets, its paths, its courtyards, its hearth fires. But the order standing over it had been replaced by another. Those who once looked upon the palace as the center of Ethiopian power now had to watch that power be replaced by the machinery of Italian rule. That feeling was perhaps not loud in the way of a battlefield, but it cut more deeply. It slipped into the way people walked in the streets, into the way they lowered their voices, into the way they looked at patrols, into the way a city came to understand that from now on, even its very form could be rewritten by the hand of another. And then that is precisely what began to happen. Britannica notes that during the Italian occupation, Addis Ababa saw the construction of many modern stone houses, especially in the European residential quarters. Many roads were paved. The Gefarsa Reservoir was established to the west, and the Akaki hydroelectric station was built to the south. These are only a few lines of fact. Yet, if you look slowly enough, you can see within them an entire sad paradox. The city was being modernized at the very moment it was being stripped of the right to govern itself. The roads were better. Building materials had changed. Infrastructure was expanded. But none of these things grew out of a future Addis Ababa had chosen for itself. They arose under a colonial order, serving above all the machinery of rule, the European quarters, and the imperial image Mussolini wished to display. If you were to pass through Addis Ababa in those years with the eye of imagination, perhaps you would see two cities layered upon one another. One city was the old Addis Ababa, still alive in Ethiopian memory, with its palace, with the spaces that had grown around the court, with the breath of a young but free capital. The other was the new Addis Ababa through the eyes of colonial rulers, where districts were rearranged, roads remade, and another layer of architecture began to press itself into the landscape. Those two layers did not merge peacefully. They existed side by side in a quiet tension. On one side was memory. On the other was power imposing itself upon stone, upon water, upon electricity, upon space. And in between stood the people of the city, learning how to live in a place that was both familiar and strange. Theirs, and yet no longer fully theirs. It is the kind of transformation outsiders can easily misunderstand. From afar, the occupiers could say they had brought roads, reservoirs, electricity, stone-built houses. But a city is not measured by structures alone. It is also measured by the question of who has the right to decide why those structures rise. And for whom. In Addis Ababa, the physical changes of the years 1936 to 1941 unfolded at the same time. Ethiopia was being folded into Italian East Africa, and supreme authority was resting in the hands of the Italian fascist state. The more closely one looks, the clearer it becomes that this is not merely a story of urban development. It is the story of a city being forced to wear the face of another empire. For Addis Ababa, this must have been especially bitter, not long before. This city had lived in the afterglow of Adwa, in the memory of Ethiopia defeating a European power and affirming its sovereignty. The Treaty of Addis Ababa in 1896 had closed the earlier conflict with Italy by recognizing Ethiopia's independence. And yet only 40 years later, it was that same defeated enemy that returned, this time with airplanes, mechanized forces, and the full war-making capacity of a fascist state bent on building an empire. The irony of that must have been burned deeply into the city's memory. Addis Ababa was not merely occupied. It was occupied by the very adversary once refused at Adwa. Meanwhile, beyond Addis Ababa, the world itself was witnessing a profound moral fracture after leaving Ethiopia. Haile Selassie went to Geneva and addressed the League of Nations on June 30th, 1936, calling upon its member states to recognize the danger posed by Italian aggression. Britannica regards that speech as one of the most famous moments of his life. For Addis Ababa, that meant the city was not only becoming an occupied capital, it was also becoming the symbol of a broader failure. The failure of the international order to protect an independent nation against imperial conquest. That shadow made the newly paved roads in the city feel all the more silent. They could not conceal the truth that beneath them lay a silence imposed by force. And yet, Addis Ababa was not a city that surrendered entirely in spirit. Beneath the surface of colonial order, resistance never vanished altogether. Perhaps that is something every occupied city understands well. A place may be controlled by guns, by administrative offices, by new flags and new maps, but its soul is far harder to seize. Ethiopians continued to resist the occupation in many places, and even in Addis Ababa, where Italian authority wished to turn the city into a showcase for empire. There were undercurrents of anger, fear, and refusal. Outwardly, the city may have been forced into silence, but inwardly, it still remembered what it had once been. Then in February 1937, Addis Ababa endured one of the darkest memories of its life. After the attempted assassination of Viceroy Rodolfo Graziani on February 19, 1937, Italian forces carried out a bloody reprisal in Addis Ababa from February 19th to 21st. The Italian Museo della Civiltà, in presenting a work on Yekatit 12, notes that the massacre claimed the lives of roughly 19,000 Ethiopians. According to historians' estimates, it remains one of the city's deepest wounds under occupation. If the paved roads and the new buildings were the face the empire wished to drape over Addis Ababa, then Yekatit 12 was the true face of the violence beneath that mask. When telling this part in a bedtime story, perhaps what must remain is not the most violent imagery, but the heavier feeling of the city after that event. Imagine the streets suddenly falling into a deeper hush, doors closing more tightly, faces meeting one another with a new fear. A city once occupied now burdened with the memory of collective reprisal as well. From that moment on, Addis Ababa was not merely a place ruled by Italians. It was a place where people understood all too clearly the price of living beneath a fascist regime. There are certain pains that do not need to be shouted to alter the color of an entire atmosphere. Yekatit 12 must have been such a pain. And yet, the history of a city is never only one color, even in the years of occupation. Addis Ababa continued to live in quieter ways. People still had to cook, to carry water, to find work, to raise children, to move from one day into the next. Perhaps that is what allows every city to survive upheaval, not because it is unhurt, but because the small life within it never entirely agrees to go dark. A shopkeeper still opens his door. A craftsman still repairs what is broken. A family still gathers around the evening meal, even while the streets outside are full of soldiers and the emblems of an alien power. It is those small continuities that keep Addis Ababa from becoming an empty backdrop. Even under imposition, it remained a place where human beings clung to the last fragments of ordinary life. And in those same years, the city seemed to live in a strangely divided state, as though two layers of time had been laid upon the same ground without ever truly blending into one another. On one side was the layer of colonial modernization, with its new stone houses, repaved roads, reservoirs, electricity, and European residential quarters, all carrying the outward appearance of order, technique, and a carefully arranged future. But beneath that surface, Ethiopian memory had never disappeared. It remained in the way people looked at the city, in what they remembered of it before the occupation, in the quiet and enduring feeling that Addis Ababa belonged to another rhythm, another spirit. People might look upon a new road, flatter and straighter than before, and still know clearly that it had not truly been opened for them. They might walk past a useful structure, a reservoir, a power station, and feel within themselves that it was a mark of loss rather than pride. It is perhaps this very paradox that makes Chapter 5 so especially important in the larger story of Addis Ababa. It reminds us that not every material change in a city is a sign of freedom, and not everything that resembles progress truly belongs to those living beneath its shadow. At times, a city may appear more modern at the very moment its soul is being tightened more harshly than ever before. Then World War opened a new turning point, and with it, in the heavy air of Addis Ababa, another movement seemed to begin, faint at first, but clearer with each passing day. When Italy entered the Second World War in June 1940, the broader fate of the world began to touch the fate of Ethiopia. Britain recognized Haile Selassie as a full ally. He was no longer merely the exiled emperor speaking to the conscience of the world, no longer only the tragic image of an invaded nation. He had now become part of a practical effort to reclaim his homeland, from Sudan. He helped train an Ethiopian force working alongside the British, preparing for a return that only a few years earlier had seemed more like a distant hope than something within reach. Early in 1941, Anglo-Ethiopian forces entered the country. Italian power in East Africa gradually weakened, and the news of it must have spread into Addis Ababa like small ripples before the true turning of the wind arrived. Then, on April 6, 1941, British forces entered Addis Ababa, and exactly 1 year after he had left the capital. On May 5, 1941, Haile Selassie returned to Addis Ababa in victory. But this was not merely the return of an emperor for the city. It was the moment an occupied place began to reclaim its own name, memory, and dignity, as though after years of being forced to breathe in the rhythm of another. Addis Ababa could finally draw in one long breath with its own lungs again. That moment must have felt strange to the city itself. 5 years is not long when measured against centuries. And yet it is long enough for a child to grow, for a generation to begin learning what fear means, for many roads to change their face, and for the memory of a free Addis Ababa to gather dust. When the emperor returned, he did not return to a city as intact as the one he had left. He returned to an Addis Ababa that had been renamed in the imagination of empire, carved with new lines, wounded and taught to endure. That is why May 5th, 1941 was not merely the end of occupation. It was also the day a city began to reclaim itself, even though that work could never be completed in a single morning. And perhaps that is the truest place at which to pause this chapter, not at full liberation, because that belongs to the next chapter, but at the threshold itself. When Addis Ababa had only just emerged from 5 years of occupation and still bore all its marks, the city had passed through a very particular trial, forced to wear the modern form of an empire not its own, ruled as the capital of Italian East Africa, made to witness violence and reprisal, and then finally reclaimed in the midst of World War. As tonight closes this chapter, what perhaps remains is a layered image: paved roads, European quarters, reservoirs, electricity, occupied squares, doors shut tight in fear, and then, far away, the sound of footsteps returning. Addis Ababa did not vanish under Italian occupation, but it had to pass through one of the darkest stretches of its life in order to learn how to stand again. Imagine Addis Ababa in the first days of May 1941. The morning light still fell across the roads of the Highlands. The wind still moved over the open stretches of land and the hillsides around the city. But after all that had happened, this place was no longer the Addis Ababa of earlier years. 5 years of occupation had left upon it not only visible changes, but also a much heavier layer of silence. And then, on May 5th, 1941, exactly 1 year after leaving the capital, Haile Selassie returned. For him, it was the day of reclaiming the throne. But for Addis Ababa, it was the moment a city torn from its own hands began to recover its name, its memory, and its dignity. Of course, no miracle could make every wound vanish in a single morning. The roads were still there. The walls were still there. The traces of those years of occupation still lay upon the ground like a memory that could not easily be washed away. But the air of the city had changed. Addis Ababa no longer had to live beneath the breathing rhythm of its occupier. After so many months of being forced into silence, it could finally begin to breathe again in its own cadence. What is most memorable about Addis Ababa in those years is that the city was not merely reclaimed. It seemed almost to be born a second time. After the years of occupation, people did not simply want to sweep away the marks of a bitter era. They wanted to raise up a different capital than before, broader in its vision, steadier in its bearing, and brighter in the way it appeared before the world. Haile Selassie did not return merely to sit once more upon the throne. He returned with the intention of making Addis Ababa the face of an Ethiopia stepping out of war, carrying new ambitions, a new rhythm of life, and the belief that this country did not merely still exist, but could continue forward on its own feet. If you were to walk through Addis Ababa of the years after 1941 in your imagination, you would perhaps not feel an immediate change that was loud or dazzling. The city did not come back to life like a fire flaring up in a single night. It revived more slowly than that, more quietly than that. Offices reopened one by one. Old structures were set back into place. The bonds between the capital and the rest of the country were tied back together little by little. Those who had lived through occupation gradually learned to look upon the city with different eyes, not only as a place that had suffered, but as a place that could still begin again. Addis Ababa in those years was like a tree after a long winter, seemingly silent for far too long, yet deep within. Sap was quietly beginning to rise again, and that renewal did not exist only in spirit. It had to appear in things close to human hands, in schools, in hospitals, in roads, in administrative offices, in signals of communication linking the city to lands farther away before the war. Haile Selassie had already begun many such efforts, but all of them had been interrupted by the Italian invasion. After the war, those unfinished things were taken up once more, only this time. They no longer served merely as signs of change. They carried a deeper meaning, to prove that Ethiopia could build its own future for itself, and Addis Ababa, day by day, grew again as the center of that effort, not only as the capital of power, but as the place where knowledge, organization, and hope began to gather. From here, the city began to change in a very particular way, not through one sudden transformation, but through many overlapping layers of change. One layer was the gradual rebuilding of the machinery of state. Another was the increasingly clear concentration of educational and administrative institutions within the capital. Yet another was the growing sense that Addis Ababa was being prepared for a role far greater than before. It was no longer merely the residence of the court or the center from which the country was governed. It was gradually becoming the place where Ethiopia wished to place the face of its future. It was in that atmosphere that Addis Ababa entered its true period of rebirth. Not like a flower bursting into bloom after a single rain, but like the first light of day spreading slowly across the Highlands. Quiet, yet certain. This city had once been occupied, once been forced to wear the shape of another, once lived through the heaviest years of memory. But now, each stone, each road, each office reopening, each new classroom, all began to speak of something else. Addis Ababa was still here, and it would not merely rise again, but move forward. Then, by the end of the 1950s, the city took another step forward, and this time not only for Ethiopia, but for all of Africa. The United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. The ECA was established in 1958, and its first session took place in Addis Ababa, beginning on December the 29th, 1958. This was not merely an international conference held in the capital. It was a sign that Addis Ababa was beginning to be seen as a fitting place in which to discuss the future of an entire continent. In the language of cities, that was an enormous shift. A place that had once been born from the hot springs beneath Entoto was now becoming the address of African economic dialogue at the level of the United Nations. That fact alone was enough to change its character. And then Africa Hall appeared, almost as a perfect symbol of that dream. According to the official history of Africa Hall, the building was designed by the architect Arturo Mezzedimi and inaugurated by Emperor Haile Selassie in 1961. The structure would later become one of the most iconic symbols of Addis Ababa, not only because of its architecture or its scale, but because of what it witnessed. In the imagination of a nighttime documentary, Africa Hall appears as a place both solemn and luminous, where the walls seem to have been built not merely to contain meetings, but to hold a shared dream of post-colonial Africa. Addis Ababa, at this point, was no longer only the capital of Ethiopia. It was beginning to learn how to stand in the role of a city belonging to the continent. If there was a single moment when the rebirth of Addis Ababa reached its deepest layer of meaning, it was perhaps May 1963. The African Union states clearly that in that month, 32 heads of independent African states met in Addis Ababa to sign the charter establishing the Organization of African Unity. The official charter itself records the place of signing as Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, on May 25, 1963. To the outside world, this was a milestone of post-independence African unity. But for Addis Ababa itself, it was the moment when the city stepped beyond the boundaries of the nation and became a political symbol of the continent. A place once occupied by fascist Italy had now become the place where African leaders gathered to speak of unity, decolonization, and a shared future. History sometimes knows how to write the most beautiful arcs. Try to imagine the atmosphere of Addis Ababa in those days. Diplomatic convoys passing through the city, different flags appearing outside buildings, corridors full of small conversations, rooms where the voices of many nations met, tea servers, typists, interpreters, document couriers, guards, observers watching from afar. And at the center of it all stood this city, as though all its previous history had quietly prepared it for this moment. From a young camp of power beneath Entoto, from an imperial capital, from a city occupied and reclaimed, Addis Ababa had now become the place where Africa was trying to speak with itself. Britannica describes Haile Selassie as the man who made Addis Ababa the major center of the Organization of African Unity. Now, the African Union, that sentence sounds brief, but within it lies an entire symbolic project. For a city to become a diplomatic center, it needs more than buildings and ceremony. It needs prestige. the ability to receive others, international connections, and an image that makes other nations feel that this place carries weight under Haile Selassie. Addis Ababa gradually acquired those things. It had aviation, it had a university, it had international institutions, it had Africa Hall, it had an increasingly clear role in the meetings of post-colonial Africa. The city therefore carried a very different air from the previous era. It was both the capital of an ancient nation and the stage of an entirely new political future. But what gives this rebirth its deeper force is that it did not unfold only inside great halls. It also slipped into everyday life, a city with more students, more lecturers, more international officials, more flight routes, more offices, more cross-border meetings would inevitably begin to change from within its daily rhythm. Small cafes would begin to welcome unfamiliar faces. Neighborhoods would begin to hear more languages. Young people growing up in Addis Ababa would begin to feel that their city was no longer only a place of court and Ethiopian history, but also a place through which the world itself was passing. And it is precisely there that the rebirth becomes more complete. It does not rest only in buildings or policies, but in the feeling among the people that the city they live in has grown larger than itself. Of course, beneath the surface of those seemingly brightened years, Addis Ababa still remained a city with its own tensions. Modernization never arrives equally for everyone. International prestige does not automatically erase social divides within the country. A capital may appear beautiful in the eyes of diplomats while still containing many complicated corners of life within it. But that belongs to the chapters that follow. Here, what matters most is understanding that under Haile Selassie, Addis Ababa was truly reborn in many senses at once, as a reclaimed capital, as an administrative and educational center, as an aviation gateway, and as the growing diplomatic heart of Africa. And so, as we leave this chapter tonight, the image that remains is perhaps not of a city already complete, but of a city gradually lighting up from within. Addis Ababa, after the war, did not merely mend its wounds. It learned how to carry a role far wider than itself. From the sky with Ethiopian Airlines, from the lecture halls of University College of Addis Ababa, from the meetings of the ECA from Africa Hall, and from May 25, 1963, when the OAU Charter was signed here. This city gradually entered a new definition of itself. It remained Addis Ababa of Ethiopia, but at the same time, it had begun to become Addis Ababa of Africa, and that was its most beautiful rebirth. Imagine Addis Ababa in the early years of the 1970s. The city still carried the appearance of a post-war capital that had grown step by step under Haile Selassie. Government offices were still functioning. Schools still saw young people coming and going. The avenues, the halls, the administrative and diplomatic quarters still gave the city a certain air of dignity. But beneath that outer layer, the weariness of the whole country had already begun to gather. Britannica notes that by early 1974, Ethiopia had fallen into crisis because of inflation driven by rising oil prices, drought, and famine in the north. While the government responded weakly or denied the situation altogether at the same time. The increasingly radical student movement in Addis Ababa had come to see the old order not as the solution, but as the problem itself. Such things do not always make a loud sound at once, yet they alter the atmosphere of a capital even before the regime collapses. A city like Addis Ababa often feels the fracture earlier than most other places. Here there were schools, officials, officers, people working within the machinery of the state, and small conversations moving from one corridor to another. When faith in an order begins to thin, the capital is the place that hears it most clearly. Perhaps in those days, Addis Ababa still woke as usual, with people going to work, going to school, buying and selling, praying, and yet somewhere inside the city, something had already shifted slightly. It was no longer the confidence of the years when diplomacy seemed to glow so brightly. No longer the steady rhythm of a capital growing toward the future. Everything seemed to begin leaning toward another feeling, heavier, more uncertain, as though people knew that what was familiar would not remain standing for much longer. Then 1974 arrived like a door opening, not with light, but with the sound of history's hinges. Britannica notes that from January of that year, a series of mutinies led by junior officers and non-commissioned officers had begun. By June, the rebels had formed the coordinating committee of the armed forces, police, and territorial army, commonly known as the Derg. Step by step, they dismantled the institutions of the monarchy, arrested those close to the emperor, and finally deposed Haile Selassie on September 12, 1974. Addis Ababa, the city that had once served as the stage for imperial ceremony and Haile Selassie's African dream, now had to witness that entire order being torn out from within its very heart. That must have been a very strange feeling for this city, not the sight of a foreign army entering, as in the time of the Italian occupation, but a new power rising from within the country itself, from the military, from crisis, from years of accumulated discontent. If in Chapter 5, Addis Ababa was seized by an outside hand, here it fell into the hands of a force that claimed to be making a revolution in order to save the country from the rot of the old order. But for a city, new power, no matter what name it arrives under, is always, first of all, a change in the air. The old buildings still stood there, but their meaning had changed. The old offices were still open, but the voice giving orders was different. The squares, the ministries, the schools, the roads, all began to live beneath another language, the language of revolution, of purges, of suspicion, of promises of a new society. Not long afterward, struggles for power erupted within the Derg itself. Britannica records that on November the 23rd, 1974, in the event later known as Bloody Saturday, many former leaders of the old regime and more moderate figures within the movement were executed. Then, on December 20th of that same year, the new government issued its declaration of socialism. These dates may sound like dry political milestones, but for Addis Ababa, they meant that the city was beginning to be covered by a deep uncertainty. When power changes too quickly, when those who stood high yesterday can vanish overnight, daily life itself begins to draw inward. People begin to learn how to say less, to look more carefully before believing, to keep the doors of their homes, and the doors of their thoughts more tightly closed. Then in 1975, another chapter of Addis Ababa was rewritten. This time not through uniforms or ceremony, but through ownership. Britannica notes that the Derg nationalized all means of production, including land, housing, farms, and industry, for a capital like Addis Ababa. This was not merely a legal change. It reached straight into the way people lived in the city. Houses, urban land, the order of ownership, the relationship between an individual and the place where he or she lived. All were drawn into a new system, a capital that had once grown through palaces, neighborhoods, administrative centers. And the new middle class of the modern era now had to learn how to live beneath an entirely different model of state. Even the walls around its people were no longer fully the same walls they had once known. And then Addis Ababa had to step into the darkest stretch of this chapter. Britannica notes that in 1977, after Mengistu survived the internal struggle in February and took full power, he launched the Red Terror to crush armed opponents and civilians regarded as opposition, especially in the context of conflict with the EPRP and the so-called White Terror. Such brief summaries cannot fully convey the feeling of a city passing through that period, but perhaps they do not need to be told too loudly. It is enough to imagine Addis Ababa in those years as a place where fear might walk home beside a person. A place where politics was no longer confined to halls or newspapers, but slipped into every neighborhood, every whisper, every glance. A capital that had once welcomed African heads of state was now learning how to live in the tense silence of purges and distrust. Perhaps that is what makes Chapter 7 the heaviest of all. Addis Ababa did not merely witness a regime change. It witnessed the very rhythm of its urban life being tightened. A city of universities, administration, and diplomacy gradually became a city of control. Not every street corner was the same, and certainly life continued in its most ordinary forms. People still cooked, still took their children to school, still bought and sold, still tried to preserve a little warmth within their homes. But above all those ordinary things hung another atmosphere. Addis Ababa, under the Derg, was no longer the city that had been gradually lighting up from within during the early post-war years. It was a city learning how to bear the weight of a revolutionary state, determined to reorganize an entire country through both violence and command. In the years that followed, Mengistu's power seemed to make the city heavier rather than lighter. Britannica describes how the Derg eventually established a Soviet-style regime, with a state structure, revolutionary councils, and a ruling party. On paper, everything may have appeared more organized, but in lived reality, Addis Ababa had to bear the cost of prolonged war, economic exhaustion, and an extreme concentration of power. The fighting in Eritrea, the conflict with Somalia in 1977-78, and then the crisis-ridden 1980s made it impossible for the capital to breathe easily. It remained the center of the nation, but it was the center of a nation stretched taut by war, mobilization, and scarcity. Even those fields that had once been sources of hope for Addis Ababa were affected. Britannica notes that advances in Ethiopian healthcare were damaged during the Derg years, when many doctors left or did not return after training. A detail like that is enough to let you feel something of the city's atmosphere. For a capital does not live by slogans or offices alone. It lives by people of skill, by the presence of teachers, healers, and those who organize urban life. When those people begin to thin out, the city loses part of its inner light as well. Addis Ababa, under the Derg, was therefore burdened not only by politics, but by a quiet erosion within the very structures that should have helped sustain it. The 1980s passed like a long and heavy stretch of time. Addis Ababa still bore its name, still stood upon the highlands with its familiar cool mornings, still had its state offices, its neighborhoods, its crossroads through which people passed each day. And yet the spirit of the city seemed to have grown far more burdened. It was no longer the Addis Ababa of the years when Africa Hall glowed with light, when diplomatic convoys crossed the city, and when it felt as though this place stood at the center of a great dream for Africa. Now the city resembled a place straining to make its way through an era in which ideals once spoken in a great voice had become heavy, weary, and distant from the true rhythm of human life. Somewhere, on walls, in slogans, in speeches, or in official declarations, the state still spoke of revolution, of reconstruction, of a new society being built. But beneath that layer of language, Addis Ababa each day remained a city of people trying to calculate how they would survive today, how they would manage, how they would keep their families at peace in an atmosphere where war and scarcity never seemed truly to recede. Morning in Addis Ababa in those years likely still began like any other morning. Pale light spread over the rooftops, the slopes, the roads long familiar with the footsteps of people going to work, to school, to market. Vehicles were still there, people were still moving, small shops still opened, offices still lit up at the start of the day. But behind that seemingly ordinary rhythm was a caution difficult to name. People still spoke, but perhaps more quietly. They still met, but not always in ways that allowed their hearts to show too openly. They still lived in the same city, but with the knowledge that the times had made everything heavier, more fragile, and less certain than before. Addis Ababa, in those days, was not a city that had stopped living. On the contrary, it was living from day to day. Only it was a life of caution, gathering, endurance, as though the entire city were learning how to walk very slowly so as not to awaken any unnecessary sound. Within the residential quarters, life must have drawn itself closer around the most basic needs. A meal sufficient enough, a home that still retained warmth, a peaceful day without bad news, an evening sitting quietly with one's family. Such things had perhaps become far more important than any great slogan. There are periods in history when people no longer think much about the distant future, but only try to keep today from breaking apart. Addis Ababa of the 1980s seems to have been such a city. It did not lack symbols of power, but beneath those symbols, people likely felt the city first of all as a place to be endured, to be lived through, to be kept from collapsing entirely under the weight of the times. And because of that, the scenery of Addis Ababa in this period took on another look as well. The avenues no longer evoked the prospect of a capital stepping out into the world, but rather felt like spaces people crossed with minds full of worry. Administrative buildings still stood there, but they no longer gave off the same confidence they had in earlier years. Neighborhoods were still full of people, but that fullness was not quite the light-hearted bustle of ease. Rather, the necessary movement of a city that had to keep functioning even though the atmosphere above it had changed. Even when the skies over Addis Ababa were still clear, still high, still carrying the distinct coolness of the mountain region. The city itself no longer seemed light. It carried within itself a quiet weariness, as though every layer of dust in the road, every wall, every footstep had absorbed too many years of tension. Perhaps the saddest part was that Addis Ababa in those years was burdened not only by what was happening, but also by the memory of what it had once been. A city once seen as the diplomatic heart of Africa, once the site of gatherings, of hope, of a sense of opening, was now forced to live within an entirely different rhythm. And it was precisely that contrast that made its fatigue all the more visible. People might still pass by the old landmarks, the old halls, the roads once bound to brighter years, but inwardly they knew very well that the atmosphere had changed. Addis Ababa was still there, unchanged upon the map, yet in spirit during the 1980s it resembled a lamp not fully extinguished, only burning lower, more cautiously, as though trying to preserve one last little light through an excessively long night. Then, like all power that once seemed immovable, the Derg too began to wear down. Britannica notes that by 1991, the EPRDF had gained control of large swaths of the country, while the government army no longer had sufficient morale, manpower, weapons, or leadership to stop the advance toward Addis Ababa. Mengistu fled to Zimbabwe, and on May 28, 1991, the EPRDF took power during that month. The force entered the capital. In political history, that marked the end of the Derg regime. But for Addis Ababa, it meant once again crossing the threshold of an era. The city had to learn a new way of breathing once more. It had to stand beneath another power once more. It had to watch old symbols recede once more. Yet perhaps the most memorable thing when closing this chapter is not the name of whichever force won or lost. It is how deeply Addis Ababa itself had been changed after nearly 2 decades of revolution and the Derg. The city had once been the capital of emperors. Once it had been the place where Ethiopia dreamed of Africa, and Africa came to dream of itself. Then it became a capital of control, of nationalization, of purges, of the weight of the state. And when 1991 arrived, Addis Ababa was no longer the city that had once stood in the light of the 1960s. It was older, heavier, more cautious, but it was still there. And as so many times before in its history, it was preparing to enter a new period without yet knowing how much more it would still have to change. There are cities born to become the center of a nation, but there are also cities that, over time, gradually become the place an entire continent turns to in order to hear itself more clearly. Addis Ababa today is such a place. Each morning, when the first light touches the Highlands slopes and the city begins to awaken beneath its familiar cool air, very little in its outward appearance reveals the full weight this place now carries. The traffic-filled roads, the crowded markets, the roofs pressed close together along the hillsides, the administrative buildings, the hotels receiving diplomatic delegations, all coexist within a rhythm of life that is at once ordinary and extraordinary. For Addis Ababa is not only the place where people go to work, students go to class, vendors open their stalls, or planes take off and land from early dawn. It is also the place where conversations about the future of Africa continue behind the doors of conference halls. The place where declarations, agreements, disagreements, and even the greatest hopes of this continent have been placed upon the table again and again, and perhaps for that very reason. If we wish to understand Addis Ababa today, we cannot look at it merely as a capital that is still growing. We must look at it as a city carrying within itself, all at once, the memory of Ethiopia, the rhythm of millions of lives, and the echo of an entire continent. What makes Addis Ababa special today is not only the fact that it is important to Ethiopia. What makes it different is that, over more than a century, this city has gradually learned how to carry many roles at once without entirely losing any of them. It remains the city of ministries, of universities, of great markets, of thousands of people heading to work each morning. Yet, at the same time, it is also a place to which Africa continually returns. The headquarters of the African Union still stand in Addis Ababa, and as recently as February 2026, the 39th Ordinary Session of the African Union Summit was still held here. The headquarters of UNECA also remain in Addis Ababa, on Menelik, the 2nd Avenue. While Africa Hall continues to stand as a historic symbol of the continental role this city has carried since the mid-20th century, and so, if you were to move through Addis Ababa today in your imagination, you would feel that this is not merely a city of one nation, but a city of encounters. Somewhere in the city, there may be a meeting of diplomats taking place somewhere else. Perhaps an African delegation has just arrived at a hotel after an overnight flight, farther away, inside an office that looks unremarkable from the outside. A discussion may be unfolding about economics, conflict, trade, climate, or the future of the continent itself. Addis Ababa has lived with this rhythm for so long that it has almost become part of the air. People pass through these districts knowing that the city they live in does not carry only its own concerns. It also carries conversations larger than itself. And perhaps that is why the name, the diplomatic capital of Africa, is not merely a graceful phrase. It is a real feeling woven into the rhythm of life here. UN Habitat once described Addis Ababa as the diplomatic center of Africa. While the African Union still places its administrative headquarters here, but Addis Ababa today is not made only of conference halls and diplomatic flags. It is also made of the most ordinary rhythms of life, sometimes even in complete contrast to the solemnity of its official boulevards. To the west of the city lies Mercato, the open-air market that Britannica describes as one of the largest in Africa. At the center is Piazza, and to the southeast is Bole Road, with its more modern shopping areas. Between those spaces move millions of footsteps each day: wholesalers, retail buyers, workers, people waiting for transport, students, office clerks, porters, coffee sellers, and those who survive through very small trades. Yet enough to keep this city from ever becoming an empty stage for diplomacy. Addis Ababa remains the place where domestic trade is gathered and redistributed. the place through which most of Ethiopia's import and export activity passes on its way to or from Djibouti, and the center of the nation's banking, insurance, press, services, and transport networks. Perhaps that is what makes Addis Ababa today so rich in imagery within a single day. This city can be both the site of a regional summit and the place where a street vendor arranges a stall before sunrise. Both the place where international flights land without pause and the place where narrow streets are still filled with people on foot. Both the place of modern buildings and the place where ordinary roofs crowd together across vast residential districts. Britannica calls Addis Ababa the educational and administrative center of Ethiopia, home to Addis Ababa University, teacher training and technical schools, the National Library, the National Archives, old palaces, and the ministries of government. Which is to say that, even in the present, this city continues to live through many layers of function resting one atop another. Past, knowledge, administration, commerce, diplomacy. But to understand Addis Ababa today, it is not enough to look only at its role. We must also look at the pressure it is carrying. This is a city growing very fast. UN Habitat describes Addis Ababa as one of the fastest growing cities in Africa, while the report state of Addis Ababa also emphasizes that the city's population is rising rapidly. The urban area is expanding, and the city is becoming denser with each passing year. The World Bank, in its assessment of Addis Ababa's urban resilience, warns that the city faces the pressures of unprecedented rapid urbanization, including urban flooding, fires, earthquakes, water shortages, unemployment, and social vulnerability. These phrases may sound technical, but if translated back into the language of daily life, they mean that Addis Ababa today is not only a place of stature, but also a place of burden. The more important a city becomes, the more crowded it grows, the faster it expands, the more it must wrestle with the question of how people are truly meant to live within it. And that is when Addis Ababa reveals itself not only as a symbol, but as a living body forced to stretch in order to keep pace with its own development. Imagine those afternoons when the streets fill up, when the lines of traffic extend far beyond what the old roads were ever designed to bear, when new neighborhoods rise faster than infrastructure can keep up, when water, electricity, housing, transport, jobs, and safety cease to be abstract terms in planning documents and instead become the daily questions of each household. Perhaps that is the quietest truth of modern Addis Ababa. This city carries the dream of an entire continent, yet must also confront problems very close to the ground. A place capable of hosting high-level meetings on Africa's future, yet also obliged to worry about how water flows in the rainy season, how traffic moves in the crush of rush hour, and how vulnerable communities will survive in a city growing ever denser and more expensive. For that reason, whenever I look at Addis Ababa today, I always feel that this is a city living in two layers of time at once. One is the symbolic layer, where it still stands tall in its role as the diplomatic capital of Africa. That continues to be affirmed not only by the AU and UNECA, but also by recent continental events such as the Africa Urban Forum 2024 held in Addis Ababa, and by AU meetings continuing to take place here in 2026. The other is the layer of lived reality, where the city must grapple with its own problems like any other great urban center. And what is strange is that these two layers do not cancel one another out. They coexist, stretching the city in two directions at once, one looking upward toward the conference halls, the other downward toward the neighborhoods changing year by year. Perhaps that is why Addis Ababa should never be told merely as an important city. That word is too dry for a place like this. Addis Ababa is a city in which each layer of the past still rises through the layer of the present. Entoto is still there like the shadow of the beginning. The name New Flower still lingers like a reminder that this city once blossomed from a deeply human decision. The traces of Menelik, of Adwa, of the Italian occupation, of Haile Selassie, of the OAU, of the Derg, of the years of rebirth and change, still lie somewhere in the urban landscape. And then above all those older layers stands the Addis Ababa of today, a city that is at once a nerve center, a marketplace, a school, an air gateway, and a forum for an entire continent. If you were to stand on some high point and look down over Addis Ababa at dusk, perhaps you would understand this most clearly. The city spreads out beneath the soft light of day's end. Somewhere, larger buildings hold on to the sky a little longer, farther away. Residential districts stretch across the valleys and along the slopes. A lit road pulls toward the airport. A market still has people in it. An international office may still be holding a late meeting. Some family is setting out supper. A student is returning to a rented room with a bag slung over one shoulder. A driver is inching through the traffic of late afternoon. A delegation may have just landed. A policy draft may be being revised in some building near the AU. And at the same time, some elderly person is surely still remembering another Addis Ababa from different years when the city was lower, quieter, and less tugged in so many directions at once. All of those things coexist within a single evening. The city does not choose to be only one thing. It carries everything. Perhaps that is the most beautiful place from which to close the entire story of Addis Ababa. For when we look at it today, we realize that this city has never moved along a single straight line. It did not grow smoothly from past to present. It has been bent off course many times, remade, wounded, lifted, weighed down, and then pushed onward again, and precisely because of that. Addis Ababa today has a depth that very few cities possess. It is not merely a capital functioning well or badly. It is a living memory, an open forum, a city straining as it grows, and a place to which Africa continues to return in order to speak with itself. The AU is still here. UNECA is still here. The summits still come. New problems continue to pile themselves upon old layers of memory. And the city continues to breathe beneath all that weight. So, if tonight we must leave Addis Ababa behind us, perhaps the final image should be that of a city never truly finished. Not a museum standing still for Ethiopian history, not a diplomatic postcard of Africa, but a place still being written day after day. There are still people who come here to meet about the future of the continent. There are still people who live here and must worry about today. There are still roads connecting the past to the present. There are still cool, crisp mornings on the Highlands, where a city once called the New Flower continues to bloom. Not always gently, not always completely, yet still with endurance, as though its history had never truly come to an end. And now, as our journey through the slopes of Entoto, through the hot springs veiled in mist, through the royal encampment, the stone roads, the diplomatic halls, the years of war, and the avenues of modern Addis Ababa also slowly recedes behind us. Perhaps you have begun to feel that this story was never merely the story of a city chosen to become a capital. Tonight, we have traveled through a place born relatively late in history, and yet burdened with the weight of so many different ages. We have seen an Addis Ababa that began in the chill of the Highlands and the warmth of the hot springs at the foot of the mountain. We have watched it grow alongside the ambitions of emperors, alongside the footsteps of soldiers, merchants, priests, students, diplomats, and ordinary people quietly living out their lives within a city forever changing. We have seen it, at times, become a symbol of sovereignty, at times, fall beneath the shadow of occupation and upheaval, and yet continue to rise, until it became one of the most important diplomatic centers in all of Africa. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey tonight. If you love historical stories told this slowly, this gently, and this deeply, please subscribe to the fan page so you will not miss the nights to come and before sleep begins to draw you under. Let me know what story you would like to hear after Addis Ababa, another ancient city, a vanished empire, or the life of a historical figure whose echo still lingers into our own time. Wishing you a peaceful night and a very deep sleep.